Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Sunday Stream. I apologize for the delays as of last week in our other discussion that we're going to have on industrial warfare that will probably be its own separate video, but I do have plenty of housekeeping to get to at the end, so by all means do stick around. So today I thought that given the recent article from John J. Mearsheimer in Foreign Affairs magazine, as well as other current events that have gone on from Turkey and ongoing rhetoric between the West and Russia, as well as yesterday's news, that we probably should be talking more and more about escalation, as well as things along the lines that we've talked about before, such as the security dilemma and the bargaining model of war. Because despite all of our modeling, John J. Mearsheimer has brought up some very good points that are worth discussing because oftentimes models are just models. And when it comes time to actually have iron sharpen iron, oftentimes they have to go back and look back at what we've written because plans and the truth are usually the first casualties of any conflict. So, today, we're going to be reading through Mearsheimer's article. Skeptical Waves has done a wonderful job of already providing audio narration. So, for those of you who have already done your homework, courtesy of Skeptical Waves, good on you. You guys are fantastic supporting our favorite robot. And we're going to do some reading today and provide some takes throughout, and then sort of discuss some of the overall issues in here that I think are really worth taking away. So, I'm going to hide my little froggy self here for a minute. I will turn the camera on later. I have a lovely tie, very fitting for today. But we'll get started primarily with the article. So here we go. Um, Playing with fire in Ukraine, the underappreciated risks of catastrophic escalation. August 17th, 2022, by John J. Mearsheimer. Western policymakers appear to have reached a consensus about the war in Ukraine. The conflict will settle into a prolonged stalemate, and eventually a weakened Russia will accept a peace agreement that favors the United States and its NATO allies, as well as Ukraine. Although officials recognize that both Washington and Moscow may escalate to gain an advantage or to prevent defeat, they assume that catastrophic escalation can be avoided. Few imagine that US forces will become directly involved in the fighting or that Russia will dare use nuclear weapons. Washington and its allies are being much too cavalier. Although disastrous escalation may be avoided, the warring parties' ability to manage that danger is far from certain. The risk of it is substantially greater than the conventional wisdom holds, and given the consequences of escalation that could include a major war in Europe and even possibly nuclear annihilation, there is good reason for extra concern. Understand the dynamics of escalation in Ukraine, start with each side's goals. Since the war began, Moscow and Washington have raised their ambitions significantly, and both are now deeply committed to winning the war and achieving its formidable political aims. As a result, each side has powerful incentives to find ways to prevail and, more important, to avoid losing. In practice, this means that the United States might join the fighting either if it is desperate to win or to prevent Ukraine from losing, while Russia might use nuclear weapons if it is desperate to win or faces imminent defeat, which would be likely if the US forces were drawn into fighting. And now, this is no different from what Mearsheimer has articulated before, as we covered in the Monk debate review a few months back, discussing that this has sort of been Mearsheimer's, more or less his analysis since the war had began, that an escalation of rhetoric and tension has significantly raised the stakes of this spiraling out of control. Now, so far, cooler heads have prevailed from both the sort of American bureaucratic system of our Defense Department as well as from the Russian government, whether that means making sure that the Ukrainians do not have access to long range munitions materials that could hit inside of the Russian state, or making sure that agreements to sell or provide certain arms and technology has not been transferred the way that it has been. At the same time, similar escalation has not come out of the Russians in regards to ratcheting up their current military strategy, at least with regards to using nuclear weapons, which again would be the end all be all. Um, the logic that I've seen most likely been talked from other national security advisors and others that have been sort of in the mainstream as well as within the literature has been that these weapons are primarily, of course, for the use of deterrence. Not to be used offensively, although this isn't to discount Russia's first strike nuclear policy. But the concern that I think is worth addressing here that Mearsheimer will mention throughout is that when modeling or stepping back from rhetoric, which is very hard to do, especially in more democratic political systems in which you need political capital to gain victory, that we're going to see some very troubling abilities to find a diplomatic way out of this or to find some sort of stalemate that the American side probably wants to have. When we talked at the beginning of the year in January of 2022, that was one of the things that we discussed as a potential possibility in our 2022 predictions. Is that if war is to break out over Ukraine, because considering at that time there was only the major buildup of Russian forces, that it would most likely be seen by the West as another potential avenue for a Syria situation, providing arms and armaments to organizations, both militarily, paramilitary, and terrorist organizations that could cause the area to have escalation or to be a territory that would be considerably viewed as a failed state in that regard, making it difficult both for Russia and the region overall. And these are concerns that are definitely worth addressing that Mearsheimer will continue throughout. Furthermore, given each side's determination to achieve its goals, there is little chance of a meaningful compromise. The maximalist thinking that now prevails in both Washington and Moscow gives each side even more reason to win on the battlefield, so that it can dictate the terms of the eventual peace. In effect, the absence of a possible diplomatic solution provides an added incentive for both sides to climb up the escalation ladder. What lies further up the rungs could be truly something catastrophic, a level of death and destruction exceeding that of World War II. Aiming high. The United States and its allies initially backed Ukraine to prevent a Russian victory and to help negotiate a favorable end to the fighting. But once the Ukrainian military began hammering Russian forces, especially around Kiev, the Biden administration shifted course to committed itself to helping Ukraine win the war against Russia. It also sought to severely damage Russia's economy by imposing unprecedented sanctions. As Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin explained U.S. goals in April, we want to see Russia weakened to the degree that it cannot do the kinds of things that it has done in invading Ukraine. End quote. In effect, the United States government has announced its intention to knock Russia out of the ranks of great powers. Now, again, this is more of Mearsheimer's position that we've seen since the Monk debate, more or less since the conflict had started, stating that this has more or less been the position of the American government. And we've seen this been voiced throughout, not just out of the Biden administration, but from the more hawkish members of the Republican Party. Most notably has been Dan Crenshaw of Texas, the eye patch McCain figure, stating that really the enjoyment, the factor of the war that he seems to be enjoying the most is that it gets to weaken America's enemies without costing American lives. At this point, just American treasure. However, this does not mean that when you're saying that you're not in a war, but you're more or less directing and providing arms in which, I mean, this is something that even Tucker Carlson, of all people on Fox News, has mentioned that we are at war with Russia. It's just that we're playing the game of not making any formal declarations. And that's where we're at. And while Kiev is certainly not fallen, it does not mean that the areas in which the stated goals of the special military operation haven't been achieved, whether it's the primarily Donetsk and Luhansk regions being more or less in their area of control, and their forces are also fighting along with them. It does put us in an interesting position to see where this goes on. But the Americans have definitely made their intentions known to be more confrontational with other great powers, which means either weakening Russia economically, even though that may come at the cost of Europe. I apologize to Germany for that regard. Or, of course, being more confrontational with China. Article continues, stating, "What's more, the United States has tied its own reputation to the outcome of the conflict. U.S. President Joe Biden has labeled Russia's war in Ukraine as a genocide and has accused Russian President Vladimir Putin of being a war criminal who should face a war crimes trial." Again, more of that boomer truth regime coming in. Presidential proclamations such as these make it hard to imagine Washington backing down if Russia prevailed in Ukraine. The United States' position in the world would suffer a serious blow. Russian ambitions have also expanded. Contrary to the conventional wisdom in the West, Moscow did not invade Ukraine to conquer it and make it part of a greater Russia. It was primarily concerned with preventing Ukraine from becoming a Western bulwark on the Russian border. Putin and his advisors were especially concerned about Ukraine eventually joining NATO, which has been, again, more of Mearsheimer's logic being through here. I think that there are significant other factors besides just providing an anti-Ukrainian or an anti-NATO bulwark being right upon its borders, but also access to the Black Sea primarily, as well as the numerous amounts of natural resources that exist within the Donbass region, as well as the Crimean Peninsula. But again, this is more or less Mearsheimer's point that has been going on since February. Russian Foreign Ministry Sergei Lavrov made the point succinctly in mid-January, saying at a press conference, quote, "The key to everything is the guarantee that NATO will not expand eastward," end quote. For Russian leaders, the prospect of Ukrainian membership in NATO is, as Putin himself put before the invasion, quote, "a direct threat to Russian security," end quote. One that could be eliminated only by going to war and turning Ukraine into a neutral or failed state, which, depending on how much arms, money, and other support that can be given, I think we're beginning to see more of this take place in the future, but who knows? Toward that end, it appears that Russia's territorial goals have expanded markedly since this war started. Since the eve of the invasion, Russia was committed to implementing the Minsk II agreement, which would have kept the Donbass as part of Ukraine. Over the course of the war, however, Russia has captured large swaths of territory in eastern and southern Ukraine, and there is growing evidence now that Putin intends to annex all or most of that land, which would effectively turn what is left into Ukraine into a dysfunctional rump state, which appears to be the stated goal by recognizing the territorial sovereignty of those republics. The threat to Russia today is greater than it. Oh, yeah. The threat to Russia today is even greater than it was before the war, mainly because the Biden administration is now determined to roll back Russia's territorial gains and permanently cripple Russian power. Making matters even worse for Moscow, Finland and Sweden are joining NATO, when we'll talk about Turkey later today in today's discussion, and Ukraine is better armed and more closely allied with the West. Moscow cannot afford to lose in Ukraine, and it will use every means available to avoid defeat. Putin appears confident that Russia will ultimately prevail against Ukraine and its Western backers. Today, we will hear that they will want to defeat us on the battlefield, he said earlier in July. What can you say? Let them try. The goals of the special military operation will be achieved. There are no doubts about that. Now, so far, that seems to be the case, at least of those territorial aspects of the Luhansk and Donetsk republics, or at least within amicable goals. The fighting is still going on, and there are certainly still logistical issues, I think, that are worth addressing. In regards to the situation on the ground, I cannot speak too much of it. A, I'm not on the ground. B, intelligence is very hard to sift through when reports are coming out of Twitter, Telegram, and etc., trying to make sure what's fake and what isn't repurposed footage. However, it does appear to say that they do have rather a firm hold on this regard. Not to mention, since the beginning of the conflict, Turkey has invoked the Montreux Convention of 1936, which has been more or less a way to keep Western navies outside of the Black Sea, as well as the Bosphorus Strait. So that provides an opportunity for this to more or less stay effectively contained in this region. With Finland and Sweden joining, this is primarily on the consensus and concessions that were given to Turkey, which we'll get to later. Ukraine, for its part, has the same goals as the Biden administration. The Ukrainians are bent on recapturing territory lost to Russia, including Crimea, and a weaker Russia is certainly less threatening to Ukraine. Furthermore, they are confident that they can win, as Ukrainian Defense Minister Oleksiy Reznikov made clear in mid-July, when he said, quote, "Russia can definitely be defeated, and Ukraine has already begun to show how," end quote. His U.S. counterpart apparently agrees, quote, "Our assistance is making a real difference on the ground," end quote, Austin said in a late July speech. Russia thinks that it can outlast Ukraine and outlast us, but that's just the latest in Russia's string of miscalculations. In essence, Kiev, Washington, and Moscow are all deeply committed to winning at the expense of their adversary, which leaves little room for compromise. Neither Ukraine nor the United States, for example, is likely to accept a neutral Ukraine. In fact, Ukraine is becoming more closely tied to the West by the day, and at least its government is. Nor is Russia likely to return all or even most of its territory is taken from Ukraine, especially the animosities that have fueled the conflict in the Donbass between pro Russian separatists and the Ukrainian government for the past 8 years are more intense than ever, which is primarily why the likely countries that we've talked about in the past for diplomatic solutions has been primarily oriented around um, Israel and Turkey. Those have been some of the largest ones. Although recently, President Macron of France has been making more and more conversations with Putin directly as trying to find a more amicable means to ending this conflict without the likelihood of escalation. Currently, right now, I do think that Mearsheimer's analysis is correct, at least in saying that there's no way politically we're going to see an about face from Washington anytime soon. Now, if there are things going on in back channels that we are not aware of, or at least that I'm not aware of, then that will stand the test. Well, that will probably be the case to see what comes out of this. But for right now, most of the diplomacy is being happened by European and Middle Eastern nation states. These conflicting interests explain why so many observers believe that a negotiated settlement will not happen anytime soon, and thus foresee a bloody stalemate. They are right about that, but observers are underestimating the potential for catastrophic escalation that is built into a protracted war in Ukraine, which is things that we can also apply to similar lessons from Syria as well. It's just that there is catastrophic escalation that can be include not just in regards to military conflict, territorial concessions or losses, but also in terms of migration, the likelihood of arms falling into the hands of terrorist organizations and groups. However, the same question that needs to be asked is while maybe observers are underestimating this, the question becomes how much of that is also a consequence or a calculated consequence that is being put into effect here. There has been times, for instance, in the war in Syria, where military agencies in the United States' executive department, whether it's the intelligence like CIA or the Department of Defense, have had their own armed backed groups fighting each other inside of Syria. Now, the same question can arise here whether or not that may happen in Ukraine as well, causing other issues, not to mention regards of spillover. But this is where we're going to get to his three big aspects of where escalation is inherent. There are three basic routes to escalation inherent in the conduct of war. One or both sides deliberately escalate to win, one or both sides deliberately escalate to prevent defeat, or the fighting escalates not by deliberate choice but inadvertently. And I think it's the third one here that I will give the most attention to. Each pathway holds the potential to bring the United States into fighting or lead Russia to use nuclear weapons, and possibly both. So now we're going to focus on the American side here. Once the Biden administration concluded that Russia could be beaten in Ukraine, it sent more and more powerful arms to Kiev. The West began increasing Ukraine's offensive capabilities by sending weapons such as the HIMARS multiple launch rocket system, in addition to the defensive ones such as the Javelin anti tank missile. Over time, both the lethality and quantity of the weaponry has increased. Consider that in March, Washington vetoed a plan to transfer Poland's MiG 29 fighter jets to Ukraine on the grounds that doing so might escalate the fight in July, but in July it raised no objections when Slovakia announced that it was considering sending the same planes to Kiev. Okay, sorry, I lost my place there. The United States is also contemplating giving its own F-15s and F-16s to Ukraine. But from the USNI, which I believe is the United States Naval Institute, they had also given a report earlier this year on April 27th. U.S. missiles sent to Ukraine aren't easily replaced, as the panel tells the Senate. The United States has shipped about a third of its existing arsenal of Stinger anti-air and Javelin anti-armor missiles to Ukraine, systems that are not quickly replaced, two experts on the Pentagon buying said on Tuesday. Testifying before the Senate Armed Services Committee, Ellen Lord, who served as the Defense Department's top acquisitions official, said that Stingers cannot be replaced within the next couple of years because its production line has been shut down. Even simple items such as diodes used to regulate the voltage for these systems could be difficult to obtain. Even with the Javelin, we are probably 5 years away from replenishing that stock despite its manufacturing line remaining open, she added. David Bertrand, an executive officer of the Professional Services Council, said, "We have yet to see a single contract in place for the replacement of systems going to Ukraine following Russia's February 24th invasion," noting that 1/3 of the depletion of Stingers and Javelins, he said, that we're very much behind, end quote. Which is why the next article we'll probably cover is discussing the issue of industrial warfare. I wanted to bring this up first because I thought it was more pressing considering what we've talked before, but that article will go more in depth along with the Royal Armed Services Institute article on industrial capabilities. The United States and its allies are also training the Ukrainian military and providing it with vital intelligence that is using to destroy key Russian targets. Moreover, as the New York Times has reported, the West has a stealthy network of commandos and spies on the ground inside Ukraine. Washington may not be directly engaged in fighting, but it is deeply involved in the war, and it is now just a short step away from having its own soldiers pulling the triggers and its own pilots pressing buttons. In the same way that we also have spies, commandos, and instructors, consultants, also in Taiwan. But this, however, is directly engaging with an enemy. I think it was Charlemagne earlier who had said quite calmly that the United States government has this idea of proxy conflict that unless you manage to find direct evidence of someone named John Q. America actually pulling the trigger, then it's not really the United States. These are technical formalities, at least, to prevent actual declarations of war or escalation. And as we've talked about before, this is why I do think when push comes to shove and actual conflict is happening, that you cannot rely on game theory models. You cannot rely on the rationalist school of that, or at least in regards to conflict. Like we've talked about before, one of the biggest issues with those models is that it assumes A, that actors are rational, or B, that both sides have a firm understanding of what the playing field actually looks like. This is why things like the security dilemma happen, because there isn't adequate information or communication from either side, which clearly there doesn't seem to be from the United States or Russia, to where they're more or less talking at each other than they are talking to each other. And in doing so, this means that there are times where they don't really understand why one party is doing the way that they do. For instance, former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara during the Kennedy administration, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, had many a times on record going understanding why the Russians were acting the way that they were with regards to Cuba, saying that they weren't acting within the models that game theory would dictate, illustrating that, historically speaking, escalation is likely to happen as well as de-escalation. That models aren't always going to provide you the most reliable way to tell how your opponent, your enemy, or the other state is acting, which is why I find this cautionary article to be so important. But the article continues. The U.S. military could get involved in fighting in a variety of ways. Consider a situation where the war drags on for a year or more, and there is neither a diplomatic solution in sight nor a feasible path to a Ukrainian victory. At the same time, Washington is so desperate to end the war, and perhaps it needs to focus on containing China, or because of the economic costs of backing Ukraine are causing political problems at home in Europe. I think, needless to say, that we're beginning to see that. Although I would be remiss if I did not mention the numerous times that individuals like Radlib, Turnup, and Blackhorse have pointed out on Radlib's channel that many of our economic woes were starting before the war, but the war has certainly escalated and exacerbated them. To a point now, there has been numerous articles where many in Germany are working on how to find firewood and to stock up for it. And to a point where even France's nuclear infrastructure, which is already aging and buried under numerous regulatory problems, is struggling to provide electricity to its citizens, which already strains the ongoing natural resources diplomacy that Russia has been a champion of for quite some time. In those circumstances, U.S. policymakers would have every reason to consider taking riskier steps, such as imposing a no-fly zone over Ukraine or inserting small contingents of U.S. ground forces in order to help Ukraine defeat Russia. And we love our Vogue front page cover article star right there in the middle. And I'm curious now what his height is. I just need to know now. This is a total aside, but we're gonna just go look it up real quick. Oh, he's 5'7". The manlet theory of history has been reaffirmed here, ladies and gents. A more likely scenario for U.S. intervention would come about if the Ukrainian army began to collapse and Russia seemed likely to win a major victory. In that case, given the Biden administration's deep commitment to preventing that outcome, the United States could try to turn the tide by directly getting involved in the fighting. One can easily imagine U.S. officials believing that their country's credibility was at stake and convincing themselves that a limited use of force would save Ukraine without prompting Putin to use nuclear weapons. Alternatively, a desperate Ukraine might launch a large scale attack against Russian towns and cities, hoping that such an escalation would provoke a massive Russian response that would finally force the United States to join the fighting. Um, I do find this one to be a little more concerning than the rest, although considering the high amount of arms, potential sabotage, and other things that have been going on throughout this conflict, this would be the one that I'm probably more concerned about because it seems that every time that the Biden administration opens its mouth or when Biden is saying something behind the teleprompter that sounds out of whack, the White House press secretary immediately contradicts and corrects the administration, more or less 5 minutes later. It's that wonderful political cartoon that Caitlin Johnstone had posted a while back, where it was President Xi Jinping trying to call up President Biden, and he's asking to talk to the people that are really in charge, because that's more or less our concern. And so far, the people that are really in charge at least have not gotten to escalate the situation at home, although the House of Representatives, I think, has just recently approved another $735 million aid package to Ukraine. So while it's not $40 billion that went Lord knows where, it's another $735 million that, again, Lord knows where, in the name of aiding Ukraine. But this one, however, is the one I'm more concerned about, especially as the idea of attacking Russian towns and cities, the rhetoric continues to escalate. And of course, recent news that, again, the 3-day rule applies, but if targets, have been put in place by either the Ukrainians or by assistance from Western officials, then this may be something that could provoke somewhat of a response. Although, who knows? This becomes the question of not knowing what's going on inside the head of your opposition or another state or the figureheads of state as well. All the more reason why models typically don't stand the test of time when it comes to conflict. The final scenario for American involvement entails an inadvertent escalation. Without warning to, Washington gets drawn to the war by an unforeseen event that spirals upward. Perhaps US and Russian fighter jets, which have been coming close contact over the Baltic Sea, accidentally collide. Such an incident could easily escalate given the high levels of fear on both sides and lack of communication and the mutual demonization. To which this has definitely been happening. There has been numerous U.S. flights that have been tracked from the military over the Baltic Sea, as well as the Black Sea in some regards as well. The Baltic Sea has been an area of concern. If you want to know a little more about recent, in regards to the Baltic Sea and Kaliningrad, I would highly recommend, if you haven't already, to go watch the previous Sunday stream episode on the Silvalki Gap. Semyagog and I did a great breakdown on geography. I love doing streams with him on these issues because he always provides excellent insight. And we talked about the Baltic Sea and Kaliningrad as well. So things to look into after this one. Or maybe Lithuania blocks the passage of sanctions, speaking of which, blocks the passage of sanctioned goods traveling through its territory that make their way from Russia to Kaliningrad. The Russian enclave is separated from the rest of the country. Lithuania did just that in mid-June, which is why Semyagog and I talked about it, but it backed off in mid-July after Moscow made it clear it was contemplating harsh measures that ended to end what it considered an illegal blockade. The Lithuanian Foreign Ministry, however, had resisted lifting the blockade completely. Since Lithuania is a NATO member, the United States would almost certainly come to its defense if Russia attacked the country. I believe, however, there was some cyber attacks that have been associated or alleged to have come from the Russians in regard to that as a retaliatory response. But this is an area also that needs to be considered because the geography of the war is not located to just Ukraine or the Black Sea or the Crimean Peninsula or Transnistria. Although all of those areas are included, we have to include all aspects of where Russia's interests are geographically, but also abroad as well, whether that be in areas in which Europe has played a significant military role, such as in sub-Saharan Africa, or now more recently in the issues of Northern Europe near the Baltics. Or perhaps Russia destroys a building in Kiev or a training site somewhere in Ukraine and unintentionally kills a substantial number of Americans, such as aid workers, intelligence operatives, or military advisors. The Biden administration, facing a public uproar at home, decides it must retaliate and strikes Russian targets, which then leads to a tit for tat exchange between the two sides. All of these things that so far Mearsheimer has mentioned are not outside the realm of possibility. Again, so far we have not seen any sort of escalatory remark or policy push from the U.S. that has led to these things, at least deliberately and openly. And despite calls from the administration, the political news narrative of the United States' sort of political attention span has sort of led Ukraine to some extent fall by the wayside. This large $40 billion aid package, which has gone almost nowhere but to Ukraine, to a point where even numerous articles have had in the West have forced themselves to retract and discuss this, whether it was reports like USA Today having to change their position about asking questions as to where all of this aid and armament actually went in going to Ukraine, saying that maybe it's only 30% that it's made it there. And then the second thing being along the lines of Amnesty International talking about the Ukrainians' conduct in fighting the war itself, to which has been left to quickly reprogram and put the latest software patch in as to make sure that the narrative is still somewhat cohesive coming out of the West. So far, however, none of these things are outside of the realm of possibility. But this is the one that I wanted to talk about, and we'll get to it. Lastly, there is a chance that the fighting in southern Ukraine will damage the Russian-controlled, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce that, the nuclear power plant, the largest in Europe, to the point where it spews radiation around the region, leading Russia to respond in kind. Dmitry Medvedev, the former Russian president and prime minister, delivered an ominous response to that possibility, saying in August, "Don't forget there are nuclear sites in in the European Union too, and incidents are possible there as well. Should Russia strike a European nuclear reactor, the United States would almost certainly enter the fighting." Now, this is the one that I do have the most concern over. This has been an area in which individuals like President Macron and even more recently, President Erdogan, who has made his position more public with the Ukrainian side, despite trying to negotiate and provide an opportunity to host talks inside of Ankara and other places. This is the one that is the most likely to see happen. There has been previous allegations of fighting and attacks around this nuclear power plant and other areas that contain nuclear waste inside of Ukraine, either that the Russians control or that the Ukrainians have access to. And this is the one I think is the most likely to have happen. I think that this is primarily the reason why we've seen more selected use of more targeted and more guided munitions out from the Russians in this conflict so far, in comparison to perhaps just massive amounts of carpet bombing or artillery strikes or anything like that. I think to avoid this exactly, I think that even the the radiation concerns, just out of, not to make a direct comparison, but even the radiation concerns out of Chernobyl from the 1986 incident onward illustrates the need to be incredibly careful in this region as well. I mean, this war does have the likelihood, and do all conflicts, to increase the likelihood of biological, radiological, and other sort of toxic exposure that troops on either side are going to face, which can lead to birth defects, cancers, and Lord knows what else in terms of diseases. But to add in sort of a radiological concern would not just affect Russia, but would affect everywhere else. So, for instance, if that nuclear power plant were to be attacked, or to have any sort of reactor meltdown or deliberate leaking of radiological material, and there is spillover to a NATO country, this would be the thing very likely that could trigger an Article 5 invocation from a European state. And then, of course, there's this from Medvedev's concerns about attack or responding to European Union sites. Most likely that would be from France, as they do have the most active nuclear reactors, although doing so into any NATO state is also likely potential possibility. A deliberate strike or a terrorist attack, I'm not too sure how likely that possibility would be. I'd imagine, however, something akin to Stuxnet, as the Americans and Israelis did to Iran earlier in the late 2000s, seems to be a more likely possibility, as cyber attacks, ransomware, and targeting critical infrastructure such as electricity, pipelines, etc., seems to be the primary method of attacking nation states through non direct foreign actors. Of course, Moscow too could instigate the escalation. One cannot discount the possibility that Russia, desperate to stop the flow of Western military aid into Ukraine, would strike the countries through which the bulk of it passes, Poland or Romania, both of which are NATO members. There is also a chance that Russia might launch a massive cyber attack against one or more European countries aiding Ukraine, causing great damage to its critical infrastructure. Such an attack could prompt the United States to launch a retaliatory cyber attack against Russia. If succeeded, Moscow might respond militarily. If it failed, Washington might decide that the only way to punish Russia would be to hit it directly. Such scenarios seem far fetched, but they are not impossible, and they are merely a few of the many pathways by which that now what is a local war, hey, there's the word that Semyagog always hates, might morph into something much larger and more dangerous. So, Oliver, if you're listening, you can go chew out John J. Mearsheimer's ear for using that word you hate so much. And again, do these sound far fetched? So far, based upon the previous actions that have been at least committed by the United States and Russia and various partnering states, on the grounds that we haven't seen any escalation from February onward that would lead to direct state versus state kinetic conflict. Already throughout the conflict in Ukraine, that we've seen from February till now, there's been substantial losses on the Ukrainian side. There's been substantial losses of Russian leadership, at least from what reports have given and what the Russian Ministry of Defense has confirmed. That there is this is an example of what an actual kinetic state versus state conflict would look like, and what it would look like if it is protracted by Western aid and arms. This is a very, very hot proxy conflict, unlike, say, what's happening in Yemen, where two sides are fueling a conflict between rebels and a government in exile. This is more directly and on the ground. It would be more comparable, for instance, if, say, Iranian-backed Houthi rebels launched a military offensive inside of southern Saudi Arabia, but so far nothing like that has happened. This is really a more one-of-a-kind conflict of the 21st century, and one I do not think will certainly be the last in an era of great power competition, being far more multilateral across the globe. Going nuclear, and we're almost near the end of the article. Although Russia's military has done enormous damage to Ukraine, Moscow has so far been reluctant to escalate to win the war, and with good reason. It's surrounded by a bunch of Article 5 invoking NATO nations. Putin has not expanded the size of his force through large-scale conscription, nor has he targeted Ukraine's electrical grid, which would be relatively easy to do and inflict massive damage on that country. Indeed, many Russians have taken him to task for not waging war more vigorously. Putin has acknowledged this criticism, but has let it be known that he would escalate if necessary. We haven't even started anything in earnest, he said in July, suggesting that Russia could and would do more if the military situation deteriorated. What about the ultimate form of escalation? There are three circumstances, and again, this is all from Mearsheimer's words, not mine, in which Putin might use nuclear weapons. The first would be if the United States and its NATO allies had entered the fight. Not only would that development markedly shift the military balance against Russia, greatly increasing the likelihood of its defeat, but it would also mean that Russia would be fighting a great power war on its doorstep that could easily spill into its own territory. Russian leaders would surely think that their survival was at risk, giving them a powerful incentive to use nuclear weapons to rescue the situation. At a minimum, they would consider demonstration strikes intended to convince the West to back off. Whether such a step would end the war or lead it to escalate out of control is impossible to know in advance. And I do think that the use of nuclear weapons in this day, I'm not, from how I understand all sort of a lot of the discourse behind nuclear weapons usage. There's a great book about the spread of nuclear weapons, a debate renewed, where Scott Sagan debates through a series of dialectical articles and back and forths with famous geopolitical scholar and realist Kenneth Waltz, who died in 2013. The last edition came out a year before his death in 2012. I have the third edition of the book, so around 2000, I want to say 2008 is my edition, which talks about the conflict between Pakistan and India. And in that article, in that book, one of the points that gets mentioned that Sagan is very concerned about is that the idea of strategic or limited nuclear strikes holds reasonable concern that that's not possible, arguing that it's Pandora's box and that the likelihood of that being opened in a way that can be contained or controlled, he does not believe to be seen, especially in the heat of a moment and using infrastructure that may not be reliable in an age where the Cold War is seen to be over. However, I do not know the actual capabilities of sort of Russia's, command and, central and command sort of call and procedure for that sort of stuff. Whereas every administration in the United States gets I believe it's like I think it's actually called an NPR, I think, a sort of a nuclear weapons, or NRP, I think, or something like that, nuclear readiness, document, in which the incoming administration of every president has gotten one since Bill Clinton in the 1990s. And that sort of gives you an evaluation of America's nuclear readiness, what's being tested, and so on and so forth. But whether or not such a strike could be done in a demonstrative way that doesn't lead to immediate readiness and escalation, who knows? Not to say that there hasn't been instances throughout the Cold War where that's happened in the past, where either through miscommunication or through glitches that we really are just a few accidents away from a war or something like this from actually spilling over, which again makes these concerns for escalation to be very real. Even if one does not think that nuclear war is likely to happen in our lifetimes, and we continue to pray to God that it doesn't, it does not mean that these sort of thought exercises should not be considered with the gravest caution. And after all, if Mearsheimer's thinking this, or I'm thinking this, Lord knows that there is someone inside the Ministry of Defense and the American Department of Defense that is probably thinking the same thing. The question becomes, what do the individuals in charge actually do? In his February 24 speech announcing the invasion, Putin strongly hinted that he would turn to nuclear weapons if the United States and its allies entered the war. Addressing those who may be tempted to interfere, he said, "They must know that Russia will respond immediately, and the consequences will be such that you have never seen in your entire history." His warning was not lost on Avril Haines, the U.S. Director of National Intelligence, who predicted in May that Putin might use nuclear weapons if NATO was either intervening or about to intervene, in good part because it would obviously contribute to a perception that he is about to lose the war in Ukraine. Now, this isn't the first time that Avril Haines has been invoked. If we recall our time watching the Monk debate and reviewing it, that Avril Haines was cited there as well. After all, his prediction came from May. In the second nuclear scenario, Ukraine turns the tide on the battlefield itself without direct U.S. involvement, although U.S. involvement is still currently there. This feels somewhat a bit of contradiction. If Ukrainian forces were poised to defeat the Russian army and take back their country's lost territory, there is little doubt that Moscow could easily view this outcome as an existential threat that required a nuclear response. After all, Putin and his advisors were sufficiently alarmed by Kiev's growing alignment with the West that they deliberately chose to attack Ukraine, despite clear warnings from the United States and its allies about the grave consequences that Russia would face. Unlike the first scenario, Moscow would be employing nuclear weapons not in the context of war with the United States, but against Ukraine, and it would do so with little fear of nuclear retaliation, since Kiev has no nuclear weapons program, due to the Budapest Memorandum of 1996, and since Washington would have no interest in starting a nuclear war. The absence of a clear retaliatory threat would make it easier for Putin to contemplate the nuclear use. How likely that is, I think that this is probably perhaps the least likely one, A, on the process of Ukrainian military capabilities and fighting back and reclaiming that territory, And secondly, um, even if Putin were to use nuclear weapons in that regard, even against a non-NATO ally, I don't know how that doesn't put the nuclear genie back in the bottle in regards to retaliation. But again, mutually assured destruction is a very real deterrence in this regard. In the third scenario, the war settles into a protracted stalemate that has no diplomatic solution and becomes exceedingly costly for Moscow. Desperate to end the conflict on favorable terms, Putin might pursue nuclear escalation to win. And with the previous scenario where he escalates to avoid defeat, US nuclear retaliation would be highly unlikely. In both scenarios, Russia is likely to use tactical nuclear weapons against a small set of military targets, at least initially. It could strike towns and cities in later attacks if necessary. Gaining a military advantage would be the one aim of the strategy, but more important would be to deal a game changing blow, to create such fear in the West that the United States and its allies move quickly to end the conflict on terms favorable to Moscow. No wonder William Burns, the director of the CIA, remarked in April, "None of us can take lightly the threat posed by a potential resort to tactical nuclear weapons or low yield nuclear weapons." Um, so give me a moment here. I need some water. I don't think that no one can take it likely. I think that any nation state with nuclear capabilities or someone who is close by, I mean, every nation state, nuclear armed or not, has to consider the possibility of how to deal with tactical or um, nuclear responses. Governments plan for this. Obviously, even nation states without them do. Clearly, we've seen that throughout the Cold War and even today. The question does become how to deal with that and whether or not that leads to the nuclear genie being put back in the bottle. It would not be difficult, however, of course, to use low grade or low yield nuclear weapons in a tactical sense. You wouldn't have to target towns or cities, but also perhaps as a show of force. Shock and awe would definitely work in regards to the use of nuclear weapons. That would definitely be a way to get people to surrender. I mean, historically, that was the logic behind, or the sort of post hoc logic, I think, that was used in regards to defending Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. The argument being that illustrating these weapons and with such fear would get the Japanese Empire to surrender. And in part, if anyone knows that days before the second bombing after Hiroshima, that was actually something that was happening, that there was a call for surrender at the time. There was a lot of internal disputes within the Imperial Japanese government, but lo and behold, here we are. The question, however, becomes whether or not this leads to anything substantial. And again, these are all risks that are just being calculated as ways of escalation. Mearsheimer, keep in mind, he's not, as he is considered sort of the founding guy of the neo-realist school. Although I think Kenneth Waltz really is the gentleman behind that, but he's the one that's alive. So I'm not too sure in this regard, because once that's in a more modern context, it's a much more multipolar world, and by that I mean more than one nation has nuclear weapons. We do not know how the Chinese would respond. We do not know how the Israelis would respond. We wouldn't know how nuclear armed states like France or the UK would respond. Although most likely the UK would be far more gung ho about things, as they seemingly have been in their government as well as their media, in taking action against the Russians. Yet, in this regard, it would be easy, I think, with low grade weapons to at least take out strategic targets, whether that be military installations or electricity, and other parts of keeping a nation afloat in terms of water treatment services, so on and so forth. But even then, the question becomes, you can't calculate what maybe the fallout would be, although air bursted weapons could be different. I mean, there's been numerous tests that illustrate the limited effect about that. There's a great sort of test that was done with the Americans of testing a low yield nuclear weapon, some several kilometers above them, or at least a kilometer above them, about what that would look like for the men on the ground. Men lived. So who knows? But again, these are all various things that are very fair to consider. And I think that these things have to be considered in the way that diplomats talk about this. And unfortunately, Mearsheimer, being one of the more saner voices although he is most assuredly pro-American and very liberal in this instance. In 2020, he supported Bernie Sanders in the primary. That, this isn't because of, his idea of securing some kind of detente or peace, but things that need to be considered because the escalation is very, very real. Reporting catastrophe. One might concede that although one of these catastrophic scenarios could theoretically happen, the chances are small and thus should be of little concern. After all, leaders on both sides have powerful incentives to keep the Americans out of the fighting and avoid even limited nuclear use, not to mention an actual nuclear war. If only one could be so sanguine. Excuse me. If one could only be so sanguine. And in fact, the conventional view vastly understates the dangers of escalation in Ukraine. For starters, wars tend to have a logic of their own, which makes it difficult to predict their course. Anyone who says that they know with confidence what the path of the war in Ukraine will take is mistaken, which I do agree with that. I don't think that you can have a for sure take. Even before the war had started, I wasn't 100% certain that invasion would happen. That's why either talking to Imperium Press or even in my predictions in January, I wasn't so sure that one way or the other would happen. But here we are. And that's a very valid point that we aren't going to know what the path will be. And anyone who tells you that they do know is mistaken, unless they're like really high up in government. The dynamics of escalation in wartime are similarly hard to predict or control, which should serve as warning to those who are confident that the events in Ukraine can be managed. Furthermore, as the Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz recognized, nationalism encourages modern wars to escalate to their most extreme form, especially when the stakes are high for both sides. That is to say that wars cannot be kept limited, but doing so is not easy. Finally, given the staggering costs of a great power nuclear war, even a small chance of it occurring should make everyone think long and hard about where this conflict might be headed. This perilous situation creates a powerful incentive to find a diplomatic solution to the war. Regrettably, however, there is no political settlement in sight, as both sides are firmly committed to war aims that make compromise almost impossible. The Biden administration should have worked with Russia to settle the Ukraine crisis before the war broke out in February. It is too late now to strike a deal. Russia, Ukraine, and the West are stuck in a terrible situation with no obvious way out. One can only hope that leaders on both sides will manage the war in ways that avoid catastrophic escalation. For the tens of millions of people whose lives are at stake, however, that is cold comfort. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of our article from Foreign Affairs, written by John J. Mearsheimer, R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. So, it does bear to remind us the influence that the University of Chicago has had, whether it's the Chicago School when it comes to finance and Milton Friedman, or geopolitical realists like John J. Mearsheimer, and a certain well-coiffed fellow by the first name of Richard also comes from the University of Chicago. But with that being said, I'm going to go we're going to do this real quick, and I'll turn my camera on. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that you're all doing well on this Sunday. And wow, the viewership is very high today, so thank you all so much. I have not actually checked the chat through all this, so if you guys have made some comments, I'll probably scroll through and see what I've missed. In a lot of ways, King of Games, there are some instances that that Mearsheimer is living in the Reagan years, and in some way, Cold War, perhaps. This is something that the United States is very good at, and I think this is something from everyone, from more other critical scholars like Mitra, Dr. Mitra has noted, to even individuals like Thomas 77 has noted that the United States is really good at fighting the Cold War. And in part because most of America's foreign policy, like we've covered with Mr. Kennan, is that it is oriented around containment, and it is oriented around conflict that doesn't have the capabilities that the 21st century has now. And I think that there's some point in this in that regard. But there are certain I had something in my throat. Apologies for that. Sorry, chat. But those are things that we do have to consider in that regard. And I think that Mearsheimer highlights some of the things that need to be talked about when we do talk about this war, but also in the fact that right now there is no really thorough direct line of communication that I'm aware of between the two warring states. And I don't mean the Ukrainians and the Russians, although they have had their own talks. I do mean more specifically the United States and Russia, which is why primarily the three biggest parties that have been involved in trying to find a negotiated settlement towards this conflict has been oriented around France, Turkey, and Israel. Israel has opted to offer and host talks. The Israeli government has been more involved in this conflict as well as President Erdogan, as well as President Macron, have also visited and talked about how to find amicable and diplomatic means to ending this war. Although Turkey, out of all three of those countries, I think has the most at stake, which is why I think Erdogan will continue to play one of the more larger roles in trying to find a political end to this conflict, or at least to avoid escalation. There are several reasons as to why. One, the Black Sea, two, the Montreux Convention, and three, its already tentative state with regards to NATO and its relationship to the United States. Now, historically, Russia and Turkey have not always gotten along. This goes back centuries, whether it's the Eastern question, the Ottoman Empire, the various steppes region, of course, in the former Soviet stans that are also of areas of concern even older. So that plays a role. Not to mention Erdogan, of course, in the past has tried to court Russia in military weapons purchases, such as the S-400 missile system, and trying to find ways to coordinate intelligence and communication diplomatically with regards to the war in Syria, especially over the issue of Kurdish forces, which they wish to attack, and their ongoing Kurdish question debacle that they've been fighting for the last 50 some odd years that the United States supports. While at the same time, for instance, Turkish-made autonomous weapons and UAVs are currently being used in the Ukraine crisis in this conflict. And at the same time, they are a member of NATO, although their relationship to the West is not as strong as it once has been. Of course, this is whether it's dealing with Ursula von der Leyen of the European Union or its own diplomatic ties to the United States and its perceived antagonism from the West in regards to the 2015 coup attempt, which has allowed Erdogan to continuously have a stronger hold on power. Now, the question, of course, with regards to escalation, and this is something that Charlemagne had pointed out to me months ago that I think is worth repeating, is that at the current point in time, I do not know the political situation, or at least from what has been publicly discussed, as to what a successor to Vladimir Putin may be. He's getting quite old. I don't think he's he's roughly this. I don't actually know his direct age. I know he's in his 70s, but let's take a look real quick. So I'm not speaking out of turn. I want to say he's like 72, but we'll find out. He's 69. There we go. So he's a little bit younger than President Biden in this regard. But the question becomes, who is the viable successor? Do we see out of it? Would it be Medvedev again, or are we going to see somebody else? This is a significant political gambit for him as much as it is any other party in this area. Unlike, say, the United States, where we know that the administration can change, at least nominally speaking. It doesn't change the fact that the bureaucracy is still there. His government seems to be here and has been here for life, essentially. Other outside factors to include is where this other spillover area might happen. Escalation, of course, does not directly mean that we'll see escalation inside the areas of the ongoing battlefront in Ukraine, but we can see it in other areas, whether it be more specifically in the Middle East or what we might see in the year to come when it comes to the upcoming planting season. After all, Ukraine and Russia provide a significant amount of wheat and grain exports to the United Nations Food Program, its World Food Program, which we've talked about on this stream before. Other volatile areas include Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, South Africa, Sudan, and Egypt, areas in which both Russia and the United States have a vested interest in keeping stability in those regions. All of which means escalation, of course, which Mearsheimer talks about is primarily in the concerns of nuclear escalation, is absolutely correct. But I would also think that we'll need to be prepared to deal with, one, ongoing deterioration of our economic systems abroad and as well as at home. Supply chain crisis will continue to escalate, especially as the Americans and the Chinese continue to turn up the heat in Taiwan, which means electronic goods and the price of modern-day cars in the United States and in other parts of the world will continue to get more expensive. This doesn't even begin to touch the energy question. But when, for instance, as we've talked about on this channel before, and something to keep in mind, that a large chunk, if not the de facto majority, almost in a monopoly, of the world's semiconductor grade neon is produced in Ukraine, and those factories have shut down due to the war. It has left a significant amount of countries scrambling for the production of things that are necessary with semiconductors. And even the most basic things, like we mentioned earlier, like diodes and other places, means that the more globalized supply chain focused part of the world is going to be dealing with how to either A, manufacture things at home, or B, find alternative means of manufacturing. And despite also Russia's current close relationship with China, the other thing that also needs to be considered, of course, is sort of the escalation between the area and power competition inside Southeast Asia. India, for instance, has been enjoying a very enjoyable economic relationship with Russia since this war began, buying cheap oil, getting access to energy, as well as military armaments, which they have gotten most of their armaments from Russia ongoing since 2015 onwards. But also at the same time, the consideration needs to be kept in place in regards to that relationship with China. In a globalized world where there are more than just great powers outside of, say, the European or North American sphere, that we now have to take into consideration where other spillover might take place economically. So this includes areas like Central and South America, which there is ongoing relationships with the Chinese and the Americans that are currently fighting over that area, whether that be over regards to the Lithium Triangle, courting Chile's new government. There's various areas in which the economic needs of these nations that are currently engaged in this conflict, or simply by intelligence sharing and by proxy, their relationship to those powers, we can see spillover in places that we wouldn't expect. And in doing so, at the same time, it looks like, that we also have to deal with the Chinese at the same time. So, a protracted proxy conflict in two major parts of the world against two large nuclear armed states with their own territorial and political ambitions against the US illustrates that we are heading towards more and more crises to come. But I thought Mearsheimer's article overall was good to sort of bring up the sobering reality of things that so often gets dismissed in our political day-to-day when we talk about these conflicts. It is a tragedy, of course, that wars happen, obviously, and something that I think that bears repeating is that we are not generals, we are not soldiers, we are not diplomats or presidents or intelligence officers or spies, and so we are left to oftentimes watching horror. And I do want to sort of bring it back a little to back down to earth for a minute. I've gotten messages both from patrons and others just that are in part of that region, either in Poland or in Lithuania or in Ukraine itself, just for prayers. I've had intentions for families that are there, and I think it's important for us to realize that, and something that Mearsheimer has said in other interviews and articles, that really some of the biggest losers out of this war are going to be average, ordinary Ukrainian people and average, ordinary citizens all over the world that are now watching as the great power competition plays itself out again. And we're dealing with higher energy costs, shortened supply lines. There are places where bread and other areas are being rationed out by governments. Riots are already breaking out over the cost of living in this sort of more globalized economic system. And the war by no means has made that any better. In fact, it's exacerbated it. And I think that that's worth repeating and worth reminding. So really, I did enjoy this article. I mean, I listened to it from skeptical waves, but reading it out loud in person, I think, is always better. And this was a very good article from Mearsheimer. I mean, there are times where I think he has his occasional miss, and I do think that he has a tendency to, again, think in a lot of Cold War terms. I think that his focus on NATO expansion sometimes overshadows, I think, some of the other factors that are in play there, whether it's natural gas, ethnic and ideological reasons, the more constructivist arguments that you would hear out of the war in Ukraine, but also access to resources planting and, of course, the territorial concerns. Is the war end in sight? No, Mearsheimer knows that. I think it's very obvious that there is no end in sight and that we will have to continue to look for a diplomatic solution. Are we going to see it from the Americans or the Russians directly? No, which is why, again, you're seeing individuals, like the Israelis, like the Turks, and like the French, pursue and continue to find a behind the scenes solution in there as well. So with that, I thought that there's they don't have an accurate track record is what I'm saying. And that's the issue with constructivists, is that they are social scientists at the end. However, I do think that one of the things that they keep in mind is the impact that some of the social constructions of which makes a nation or its state. It does a lot there. And so I think that that's something that's definitely worth considering. But let's see here. Melphis999 is from that region, which I think is important. He says, here's a fun Finland politics fact of the day. Despite being mostly electricity independent, our costs are raising massively because of this current conflict. So, I mean, the reason, and there's also Eric M. On the issue of constructivists, there's a book that I've ordered, courtesy of wonderful donations from my patrons, about sort of constructivist realism. And I do plan on reviewing it thoroughly because it started out as an article I read on JSTOR, and then I found out the author actually wrote a book. And so I wanted to read it because I do think that while the constructivists alone do not are not right, the article by J. Samuel Barkin, who wrote it as a book, Realist Constructivism, I ordered it not too long ago. So I do plan on reading it in the coming months and reviewing it because, yeah, the constructivists are not accurate in regards to, say, like, in a lot of ways they're liberals, but and social scientists, right? Things are social constructs. But I think incorporating variables like what motivates a leader in regards to how does he idealize the goals of the state or his own political ends, right, are things worth considering, which is why I always bring it up, because some of the critiques against realism from the constructivist school are definitely worth mentioning. Yeah, no, yeah, that's good, Eric. Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, because I mean that's the other thing. This is one of the things that has always kept me when I read about international relations, and this is why is god awful. Right here, I'll do this instead. Which is why, as god awful as George Friedman can be sometimes, the one thing that I did take away from that book, The Next 100 Years, when I read it when it came out when I was in high school, so like 2009, 2010. When I read it back then, and what really got me into it was the argument that he made that you cannot make it about like the last 5, the last 10, the last 15 years of history. It has to be about the last 100, the last 400, because areas and regions, especially like, for instance, when we talk about Turkey, right? I mean, you have to consider the history of the Eastern question by European powers. You have to consider the Ottoman Empire. You have to consider the Seljuk Turks, right? Things that play a part historically in the way that nation has been perceived, especially when we talk about relations to European states. And so those are always things that I always feel need to be considered. And that's something that's always come into my mind, is understanding the history of it for once and for all. But again, I've provided my takes throughout the article. I think that it's very good to consider, especially when we live in a situation where, I want to move the camera down, especially where we're in a situation where we don't know where things are going. And now we're seeing escalation on the other side of the globe. Definitely things to keep in mind. Is it too hot for coffee? No, it's not. Not in my room where I've had the air conditioner on like an American, but I've had more than my fair share of coffee today after our services. So I actually have been home a lot longer than usual. Unfortunately, in my parish, our priest has moved. So he's serving a different parish community. And so we had Typica services today, so things were much shorter. So, but I've had more than my fair share of coffee today. I'd rather not ruin things. But with that, I'm going to move to announcements and some more housekeeping, and then I'll get to super chats and hang out with you guys for a bit. I have missed chat throughout my reading and sort of taking a look at the article, so I'll be able to spend some time with you guys today and catching up. So I am going to bring up Frog of the Week and all sorts of stuff. John, those are really the only two that I have. It's by my bedside where I pray, so that's it. But yeah, so let me get to Frog of the Week and all that jazz. There are two since we missed out on last week, but I wanted to start with announcements. So remove from studio, share screen, share tab audio, perfect. Share and slideshow, perfect. All right, here, ladies and gents. So I'm gonna hide my face here real quick. So I don't have any planned streams or anything for this week, the 22nd through the 30th at the very least. I may have some pre-recorded stuff, or I may record some things, but I won't be live. And the reason why, and this is why I've sort of not been as involved or posting or tweeting any effort posts or anything like that as of late, is that this week through the 22nd through the 30th, I am going to be taking care of my friend from church. She's going in for surgery for cancer. So if you could please keep Luca in your prayers. I'm taking her to the hospital tomorrow for her surgery, and I'm taking care of her elderly mom, who's 94, and her dog. So if you could pray for her, and I'll be at her place taking care of them both. So I don't plan on having anything out. I'll have a real talk out this week that I'm recording tonight. Actually, the patrons will see it first, and then I plan on having it premiere this Thursday while I'm out. But that depends on whether or not I pre-record something with Geo this week, pending my availability. So there may be no Digital Archipelago episode this week either, and there will certainly be no Sunday stream episode this coming Sunday either. So I just wanted to get that out there, so you all know, hey, what the heck's going on? Why have I not been busy? That's why. I've been taking care of my friend, getting her ready. I drove her to the hospital earlier this week for her pre-op appointment and all that jazz. So please keep her in your prayers. She does mean a hell of a whole lot to me. Recently, I put out a Substack post, so I'm going to constantly update it. It's called a list of outside appearances. So anytime that I'm not on this channel, but I'm a guest elsewhere, that will always be updated. And I've posted that in the community tab. So please pay attention to the community tab. A lot of people like Luddick Path and other people, they love to post memes when they do their updates. So just pay attention to that. That's where Substack stuff gets posted, guest appearances get posted, and all sorts of other stuff that I'm working on. So by all means, just make sure that you're staying and following there. I do plan on having some larger essays out this week, though. There's one that I have in regards that I've sent to Cars and Women magazine about, life and living, since, my friend Stained Haynes was just like, hey, you've been through some shit, so why don't you talk about life in that context? So I'll have that out for you all. My time with Pete Quinones going over Chapter 6 with the Populist Delusion is now available. So by all means, head on over to his channel or his website. It was a very good talk. It's actually what inspired my De Juvenel video. So I thought it was a very good just breakdown. Plus AA wrote a really good book. So yeah. And like I said, my patrons will see Real Talk tonight before it premieres this week. I don't think I have any other major announcements to get out of the way, other than the fact I'll be pretty much radio silent this week. But after that, we're going to hit the ground running. You all sent some wonderful suggestions for changing, the stream name. I wanted a better name for the Sunday stream, and you all sent numerous suggestions. So I'm going to go through those and maybe pick a name. The intro music will probably stay the same. The video will probably be updated, though, for using the theme itself. But those are the announcements that I have for you all, ladies and gents. And yeah, so here we go. Frog of the Week. All right, so we have two since I was out this last week. So this one, first of all, is the Spring Peeper. Found mainly east of the Mississippi River in the United States. He's a very tiny little guy over here. And you can find it in Ontario and Quebec and Canada and those provinces. It is a small chorus frog. It has a small, light, metallic chittering sound. And that's usually how you know it's springtime, hence the name, the spring peeper. So normally when you hear these little guys around, then you know it's springtime. But as its Latin name suggests, its taxonomic name, crucifer, to mean one who bears the cross, it usually has a distinctive X cross shape on its back. And it is a very small frog. It's about an inch big. And while, it has these lovely little toe pads that you can see on there, they're very distinctive and bulbous that allow it to climb. You will normally find this forest on forest floors, sifting through debris, woodland areas. You can mainly find it in deciduous forests along the United States, although you can find it in more coniferous areas towards the north in Canada. So this is our first frog of the week since we missed last week. And then this lovely picture, the Western toad. This picture comes from patron and good friend of the channel, Lance Goebel. Lance has been doing a wonderful job making sure I never repeat a frog for Frog of the Week, and to correct me in case I make that mistake. He's kept a Google Doc for me to make sure I never repeat one. But the Western toad here, this is his picture when he was on vacation. Native to southern Alaska, British Columbia, and all of the American West, so more or less from New Mexico all the way to California, as well as Baja California. You can find this fella. It varies in size, but is usually a large guy around 5 inches in length, 13 centimeters. It does have two subspecies, the boreal and the California western toads. The one that you see here is the boreal version. The ones in California are a little more brown. Although you mainly find this in wetlands, so wet meadows, treelands, forests, and other rainy parts where you can normally have a higher degree of humidity and more water and rain than its desert, than more desert toads that you would normally find that aren't as aquatic or water-based. It does breed primarily through March through July, but depending on the elevation, so if you are closer to sea level, then you can start as early as January to get spawning and to get busy. So that is the Western toad. Those are our wonderful frogs of the week. And now I'll just catch up with you all. There is a name I do need to add onto here. And I want to thank him out loud since I didn't get a chance to add his name for today, if I can get the chance. Our good friend of the show, his name is Milk Enthusiast. He has definitely been a wonderful supporter, as all of our other top tier patrons: Fearless Leader, Raging Mandrill, User 4A, 5B, 5DB5, Cowering Bugman, Preservatism, Focron, Consumer, and Hunger. These lovely gentlemen donate $20 or more or a month on Subscribestar. And there are other ways to support. So if you don't like, super chats, you can always do Subscribestar. There's a tipping option. I have a free $0 tier for that. There's also Substack. But if you don't mind dealing with YouTube, then that's always appreciated. I know I get asked all the time about entropy. I'm going to have to update my setup for that because I stream out of my laptop, which I have been using since like 2012. So I have like a 10-year-old computer that I've been doing all this work on. So it makes it a little hard to manage OBS on this old hunk of junk. Trust me, I've done some private experimentation with it. So I'll probably move my larger desktop to where I stream and do that there. But no, you guys have been really helpful right now during the job hunt, during me just doing odd jobs and ends to keep a small income stream going, taking care of pills and things like that. So I'm truly indebted to you guys. You really do keep the channel going. So with that, I'll show my face again. I'm just noticing everyone's there we go. Wonderful. Yeah, so here we go. There were a few super chats that came in, so I'm going to just read them real quick, and we'll get to them, and then we'll just hang out with you guys for a little bit. So, supers. There were 2, or I think 3 that came in. Not too sure. Or more than that. I didn't check chat. So actually, no, there's quite a few. Here we go. All right. So the first one from one of my favorite names I love reading, Big Nig 420 for 6.99 Canadian. Thank you so much. He says, can't wait to watch this when I'm off work. Thank you, Prude. Well, thank you, Big Nig 420, for being an ongoing supporter and enjoyer of the work. The next one is from Hunger. He sends two. But the first one is for $10 US, 1 out of 2. So I'll read the whole thing in full. In my honest opinion, Mearsheimer comes off as a boomer. U.S. involvement in Eastern Europe would require weeks, even months, to transport 500,000 troops and armor required. Europe is spent and vastly short amount of ammo and artillery. 2 out of 2. The second one for $5 US. Thank you so much. The U.S. is far more likely to shoot off nukes than Russia if the U.S. gets involved and defeated in Eastern Europe. In a way, yes. However, I would also argue that a lot of America's aspect of getting involved is the simple presence of American troops. That's sort of been the logic there. I mean, for instance, Poland has seen an increase of U.S. troop deployment that would not be a substantial fighting force to engage in a long-term conflict with the Russians. It's more to act as a strategic tripwire, in the same way that American presence in South Korea is meant to act as a strategic tripwire to get the United States directly involved, regardless of what the conflict may be between, say, North and South Korea independently. So in a way, yes, right. In ways, yes, he does act like a boomer in the idea that, yeah, it would require massive amounts of deployment. But I think that Mearsheimer is also just considering the idea that U.S. troops are there, and that does act as a strategic tripwire if tripped, either by the Russians or potentially and intentionally, with I think the more likely potential to, from the Americans, would still serve as a mechanism to get into war. Although I do not know how likely the U.S. is likely to shoot off nukes than compared to Russia. The U.S. does have, officially speaking, a second strike policy on paper, although I should probably start to take a look at our last nuclear readiness document that had come out to see if that's changed, at least in private. Although what is more concerning on my end, and this is something that I think that does give credence to your point, is that from second term Obama, Trump, and now this administration have all taken significant steps to distance the United States from weapons testing and weapons limitation treaty when it comes to nuclear weapons from the Russians. And that was primarily led, de facto, by the United States, which does escalate the nuclear situation and brings back sort of the arms race in regards to nuclear weapons. Not to mention the security dilemma has increased as the concerns over hypersonic weapons goes off. And to those who think that technology is a ways away for the United States, yes, at least based upon testing from the Americans. But the issue that I've raised, that I've seen in other articles and literature, has been that the problem with hypersonic weapons is that early warning detection systems can't tell the difference between, say, a non-fissile, non-nuclear hypersonic weapons launch and an ICBM. So until better early warning detection systems are detected, that raises some other concerns, right? But in a lot of ways, yeah, it's some of that old school Cold War thinking. But I think that Mearsheimer has also been in the game long enough to know what the strategic tripwire is. JS for £2. Thank you so much. McNamara is the prime example of war by spreadsheet. That is correct. And keep in mind, I mean, from working to ensure greater bomber targets in the Second World War, to war by spreadsheet in Vietnam, to McNamara's 100,000, literally using those below the standard deviation for IQ to go fight in Vietnam. It's definitely something that can be concerned. But yeah, he's definitely the most prime example of war by spreadsheet. Although there's a great article from the American Affairs Journal that I will reference ad nauseum because it's a very good article called Data-Driven Defeat about the American involvement in Afghanistan. Tuesday for $10 US. Thank you so much, man. The way I see it, the worst that can happen is Trump being reelected. White boys buying back in and gay America having the wherewithal to win in Europe. Then we will never get out of this. That's a lot of... I've heard a lot of takes in regards to what the regime would love to have happen is to have Trump back in. And I think that we've seen a lot of this, actually. Like, there was a New York Times article that someone sent me today talking about how a lot of these sort of, big city new right ideologues that, they want to criticize people like Bill Kristol and stuff, but Bill Kristol and that sort of institutions kind of is the reason why they have jobs in the first place. And so there are already ways in which sort of the politics of the powers that be can sort of keep off any people that want to actually change things. And so there's a lot of arguments that really what the regime could do the best at would be Trump gets reelected. Trump doesn't cross the Rubicon because clearly he doesn't have the wherewithal to do so. And so 4 more years of ineffectual governance. And that's a take I've seen, although they seem to be really, crapping their pants over the Schedule F thing that not just Trump, but really all the guys behind him that kind of want to get back in and get back into power after learning their lesson want to do it. But I think that really the legitimacy to sort of the system has really made it less and less likely for people to have the guff to really get back in. But that I guess that will really only tell come 24, right? Although Twitter has already put out their sort of misinformation warnings over the midterms already. So, I mean, there's already going to be more skullduggery and buggery afoot when it comes to that process. So, who see? Only time will tell. Cringe Walker for $5 US. Thank you so much. I've heard that a lot what we send there was in storage, waiting to go to Syria, so not a true cost, as we had already promised it. I mean, there has been a lot of armaments that were meant there, from what I've read, yes. And in the same way that something that Semyagov's talked about, that also we left a lot of material goods inside of Afghanistan that could also cause issues for the region or be spread out by opportunistic organizations and groups in there as well. So some of that's probably, I mean, it's not like we don't try to continuously rearm the Kurds, and when we do, so I mean, there's some potential for that. But I mean, at the same time, right, as that article that got chastised from the press, the USA Today, and rechanging their statements was that, hey, we don't know where some of this armament's going, and only 30% of it's reaching Ukraine. So it does raise the interesting question as to how much of this was meant to go elsewhere, or how much of it has already gone elsewhere. Which is why I think that when we talk about this conflict, we cannot just focus it in the immediate vicinity of the Baltics, the Black Sea, Ukraine, more or less that straight line, that belt line from Kaliningrad to Transnistria to the Black Sea. So, again, Lord only knows, right, where that money is going. But yeah, I mean, things to keep in mind. Sorry, my throat has just been awful. We finally got some rain today, and allergies has just not been good to me. So yeah, let's take a look now and see what people are talking about now that we've gone through all of the super chats and things like that. Yeah, I love my chat. I love all of you people. You guys are fantastic. You guys have been great. And so I'm very thankful for my audience and the audience that we cultivate. It's a mix of incredible international audience. The last time I checked my stats, actually, it's a very even 50% of you are Americans and the rest of you are all over the world. And my subscribe star reflects that. And so I'm always very thankful to have an international audience that can always give me what their take is or what's going on at home and things like that. So, yeah, no, I mean, yeah, that would be something to keep in mind. But I do seem to expect, and this is the thing that the Mearsheimer pointed out, required that I think is the thing to be more concerned about, is Ukrainian escalation, more so than anything. And so that's something that I do want to be more concerned about. Is, I don't think that there's any direct control over this, despite claims to the contrary. I do think that there is still a lot of agency from the Ukrainians that needs to be considered. This is something that, always gets hammered back at Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt and others in these debates is, well, you're not considering Ukrainian agency. He's like, that's correct, because they can still do things outside of the purview of what other governments and other states want. So that was something I'm definitely concerned. But yeah, let me go see what the rest of chat's talking about. Oh, his essay on Russia is definitely something that I need to talk about for sure. And I guess I can do that while I'm off this week. I didn't plan on bringing any political books with me. Actually, that was the other thing. I told my friend that I was going to do what's the word I'm looking for? That I wasn't going to be the Prudentialist for a week. I was just going to be my plain old self, Matt, and just so the two books that I have packed with me are going to be on the Cosmic Mystery of Jesus Christ by Saint Maximus the Confessor and Saint Cyril of Jerusalem's Catechetical Lectures. But I do need to go read this article for sure. Let's see here. Thoughts on the future of loitering munitions. They've been super hyped, but they've been a non-factor past the first month. Will the military-industrial complex switch gears or double down? So yeah, I would imagine that we'll probably see them being used. I mean, every new conflict, proxy or state versus state, are always an avenue to test munitions. This is why the Turks are really beginning to flex their own military-industrial complex with their what are they? The Kaba I can't pronounce it. It's like the KBM2s, their own munitioned UAVs that they're working on. Not to mention that the US has been testing some stuff out there as well. I'd imagine that stuff will come out. Only time will tell. I think that it'll find a more unique purpose as the war goes on. So who knows? Oh, glow in the dark. Yeah, reading Maximus the thankfully my catechist lives close by, and he's also read the book, so we'll be taking the time to call and go over those things, so it'll be okay. And the other thing too, right, is the switchblade things the U.S. has been putting out too. That stuff's also being I don't know if it's being tested. I'm sure it has been. I mean, otherwise it wouldn't be deployed, but its combat effectiveness is being tested. So I do think that whatever data comes out of this, right, places like what's the word I'm looking for? I mean, they'll refine it and take that data back. I mean, Raytheon did this with their technology in the past. I would imagine that they'll continue to do that as well. So, but the other thing also to keep in mind, right, is the concept of like an actual decisive victory or decisive blow or something that there is no deterrent to, which makes nuclear weapons so scary. But is Dr. Dead Name? That's a that's a great username. I don't think any weapon is going to be decisive unless deployed in very large numbers. So I wouldn't focus too much on an individual system. Unless it's something the other side has no equivalent of, which is definitely something to keep in mind, is about deterrence. And so, yeah, I mean, and I know that they've been using switchblades as well on armored targets as well. So it's not like all these things again, right? We're literally watching these things being tested. And the answer to that is no. Oscar Toe in chat, I see that. Oh, well, there you go. That's just a good question. What do you expect will come from the G20 summit? Both Putin and Xi will be there, and the tensions will be high. I would imagine an ungodly amount of back channeling and an ungodly amount of diplomacy while doing very, very public condemnations and rhetoric against one another from the Western countries. But I would imagine a ton of behind the scenes cloaked room sort of stuff, diplomacy. There you go. Look at that. Happy to hear that, Charlemagne, you're doing well. Glad to hear. So glad that Starlink was easy to set up. I hope that your move is doing well. I know that in group chats you've been sending us updates and that things are going well. I pray that Mother Nature doesn't send anything out to get you guys. But yeah, so plenty of stuff to go on in the future. But this week, again, all that I ask is that your prayers for my dear friend, and I'm going to leave it at that for all of you today. So I hope that you all have a fantastic rest of your Sunday. You guys have been a fantastic chat. Your feedback is always good. I'll probably watch the live replay and see if there's anything good here worth writing about, because you guys have been just as much of a muse as the various people that I talk to. So with that, patrons, watch your Subscribe Star email notifications. That way you guys can see the real talk. And you guys will see it next week. I will keep you apprised via community tab, tweets, and Telegram posts about how I'm doing with regards. And yeah, that's the other thing I'll mention before I leave, is in regards to the assassination of Dugan's daughter. I do not know enough in regards to, we don't have enough information about responsibility, who's claimed. I am by no means or anywhere in the world a Eurasianist, never have been. But it is always a tragedy when a father loses their daughter and someone has to bury their kid. And to me, that's always terrible. And so, but with all that being said, do pray, regardless, for an end to the conflict and everything going on. And again, I'll leave it off by saying just pray for my friend. And I'll see you guys when I can. I will stay updated through all my social media. So have a great rest of your Sunday. Take care. Be prudent, everybody. God bless.